Everyone has prejudices, whether they realize it or not. Racism is defined as how that comes out, is acted out with against a particular race.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Baha'i on Air. I'm Bev Watson. Today's program is called Healing Racism, and to help us to discuss this subject we have with us a special guest from the United States, Leslie Randall. Leslie is a registered nurse and has her master's degree in public health. She is also a member of the Nez Perce tribe of the Ngimi Nation from the United States. She was invited to come to New Zealand as a keynote speaker for the 6th International Conference on SIDS, Sudden Infant Death Syndrome, or COT death. Okay, the topic we're going to be talking about today is healing racism, which is based on the book by Nathan Rothstein on healing racism in America. Can you tell us how that got started?
He started the institutes to address the issue of racism, and we have started working with the principles that he has and using it as a tool to heal racism. It's spread throughout the United States, and it started out with a group of Baha'is, but it has since become non-denominational, non-religious.
So the program is inspired by the Baha'i faith, but it now involves people from different races, different religions, all kinds of things.
Once we started the Institute, we realized that it was an issue that was felt by other races, and we were amazed at how we were able to bring people that we weren't even aware there was such a large population of Asians and African Americans, and we brought together the Tuskegee Airmen, the local chapter of the NAACP, the Indian White Relations Committee, and the Latina population, in addition to the Asian population.
And how did it work when you had all those different ethnicities involved?
It actually worked quite well. We weren't just going with ethnicity. We also included the local Jewish community, which we found out there was quite a large Jewish community, and we included some of the black churches, and there were two, which we hadn't really realized there were that many, and then we also included some of the Christian, Catholic, and Presbyterian Protestant churches in the area.
So, Leslie, I understand that the institutes run for 9 consecutive weeks, 1 or 2 hours each time, and that there are different topics discussed each week, but that basically the central theme of the whole institute is the oneness of humanity.
One of the most important things to remember about the Institute is that it's not just healing racism, but that the main purpose of the Institute is to address the unity of mankind. Because if you lose that concept, then you've lost the whole thing.
And I think on the very first night, the topic that's discussed is defining prejudice, defining racism. How do you define prejudice and racism?
Well, they are two separate things, and everyone has prejudices, whether they realize it or not. And it's by defining prejudice and recognizing that everyone has a prejudice, whether it's a prejudice against the color of a person's skin, or a prejudice against a certain product, or a prejudice against the way someone talks. Racism is defined as how that comes out, is acted out with against a particular race. So,
right,
and it goes both ways.
Sure.
Whether or not a lot of people don't realize that those of us from the minority or indigenous populations have prejudices also, and we practice racism.
Very recently, of course, we trialled the Institute for the Healing of Racism here in New Zealand for the very first time. How do you think it worked, taking an American program and plonking it down here in New Zealand? Did that work okay?
I found it very interesting because from one of the reasons that I was brought to this country was to address racism as it affects health professionals and how it affects health professionals working with out in the Indigenous population. But that was their perspective, from their perspective. So when we did the Institute and we talked to some of the people that were actually dealing with racism in this country, even though it's not as blatant as in our country, in the United States, it came out that they did experience it, which a lot of people were like, it's very subtle in this country as opposed to in the United States. So that was one of the most interesting things I found, is that the subtleties of the racism.
One of the things that we discussed on Saturday at the Institute was how racism is perpetuated. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Some of the stories that came out were talking about dealing with children of mixed marriages and how one child may be lighter than the other. And one individual was talking about how difficult it was for the darker child, because the darker child experienced much more racism than the lighter child, whereas the lighter child could pass as white, and oftentimes did, whether he didn't, as when you're 7, you don't really think about passing, you just think about fitting in.
The Institutes, of course, are based on the book by Nathan Rothstein called Healing Racism in America. And the term healing sort of implies we have a disease, an illness, a sickness, something of which we need to be cured. Can you tell us why Nathan chose that kind of terminology?
It's a disease that is perpetuated throughout from the time you're born. And Nat defines it as a cancer that is that people don't realize that oftentimes they have until it is exposed. And until you can take that cancer or that disease out of your system, you'll be infected with it for as long as it stays there. If you look at it as a disease, then we can heal it, and we can work on it, and we can overcome it. And it's by looking at it in that viewpoint that you realize that racism is something that can be healed.
A cancer, if you literally have a cancer in your body, then getting rid of it by surgery or chemotherapy or whatever process you undergo is going to be a very painful process. So I guess the analogy is that it's the same with racism.
We found that on Saturday that feelings and emotions came out that people oftentimes don't realize they have. One of the, and this is a story I tell about myself, when I realized that I had prejudice and racism, is when my husband and I, who is white, and he's Italian American, but he's still considered white in our country, and he wanted children. And for me, I didn't have, I had never thought of having mixed children. So when I thought about it, and I thought, oh my God, I don't want a mixed child. But because I really did love him and I believed in the unity and oneness of mankind, it took us about 6 months to work it out, but it did help me to address the issue of racism within myself.
So what was the biggest problem for you? Was it the fact of knowing that your mixed race child was going to face difficulties as a mixed race child, or was it because you just couldn't imagine having children with somebody from a different race to yours?
It was both, but it was primarily having a child with a white person, and because of that I had to address my issues of prejudice and racism within myself, and looking at this person as a person, not defining him as someone who wasn't human. Because when you look at someone who is not of your race, a lot of times what happens is you don't look at them as human beings. You look at them as almost as subhuman.
So what you're saying is that, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that you learned racism within your culture in the same way as we as whites learn racism within our culture.
And we don't realize we pass it that it's passed from our parents to us, to our children. And until we can get to the point where we heal that racism and we get past that and heal it as a disease.
I remember you talking the other day about an example in Australia of what happened with the Cot Death Association, or whatever it's called over there. Once they got the death rate from cot death down to a very, very low level amongst the white babies. Tell us the story of that.
It's in countries where the SIDS rate is dropping to almost nothing in the white population. And in those countries, instead of putting the money into looking at trying to find ways to reduce the incidence of sudden infant death syndrome in the minority and indigenous populations, they are expanding their services to include children up to 5.
So that's really an example of institutional racism.
That's one of the best, I think.
Yeah, at the Institute on Saturday we were talking about how sometimes people behave differently when they're with their own race than they would do if they were in a mixed group.
Yes, one young lady talked about how difficult she was having addressing it within her own race, and one of the ways that she wanted to find a way that was dignified, but address the issue with people of her own race. And she was white, and she talked about how when she is with people of her own race, that they tend to make racist remarks that they don't or won't make when they're in mixed company.
So how do you challenge something that you come across?
Well, thinking back to the story you told and a story I told, it was actually the same story with your child addressing the issue of racism with someone who made a racist remark, and he very simply just said, that is a racist remark. Not saying you're racist, not saying anything else, but saying that is a racist remark. And for me, my son, I made a remark and my son told me, he says, "Mom, that's racist," you know. And so if you can say that without pointing a finger at them and saying, "You're racist," then just letting them know that it is a racist. And it's much easier, and you don't degrade them or yourself.
Perhaps you could tell our viewers what the Baha'i writings actually do say about racial harmony, about the oneness of mankind.
Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, one of his main principles is the oneness of mankind. And so when I talk about it as being something that is essential, when Baha'u'llah talks about the oneness of mankind, he says that we have to become as the flowers of one garden, the leaves of one tree, and without that we can't progress as a human race.
So we're not talking about unity and uniformity though, are we?
No, diversity. If you don't have the different colors, then it's not as beautiful.
The other day at the Institute we were talking about stereotypes. Can you explain how stereotyping affects us in the way that we behave?
It's interesting when I go outside the United States, or even to the East Coast of the United States, where they don't have much contacts with American Indians, and their perception of us is Pocahontas, the movie, Disney movie, and it's very stereotyping. Or with the African American of where they would have the dancers with the black faces and or the servants in the movies, and or like you said the other day about the individual you ran into at the store, calling them coconuts. You know, that's stereotyping, and how it affects people is it's very dehumanizing and very very much against what we believe as Baha'is, unity and oneness of mankind.
I know another topic at the Institutes is ally building to heal racism. Can you explain exactly what that means?
One of the reasons that I was brought to this country was for the 6th International Conference on Sudden Infant Death Syndrome, cot death. And they asked me to address this as a researcher. How do researchers try to address this issue? And it's only when you start bringing everybody to the table as equals, and it works out in the community just as much as it does in the research community, that if you come to the table as equals, then you are able to see each other as equals. And that's part of the problem, is that so many times when you look at another person and all you see is the color of their skin, you're not seeing them as people. You're not seeing them as an individual.
So ally building is really when all the different parties come to the table as equals to resolve a particular issue, whatever it might be, cot death or whatever.
Right. And then not just races, but institutions. If you bring the institution of Christianity, the Christians to the table, and you bring the Jewish because there is a lot of racism and prejudice between those two, and against Baha'is and against other people, the Muslim. But if you address it as people who are wanting to heal racism and heal injustices, then you can really become a good way to build bridges to address some of these issues within the community.
Yes, we're just in our papers very recently, we've had an incident in South Auckland where the people have just refused to be the subjects of research anymore because they're not really being taken in on board and being really part of the process. They are being treated as subjects, and they've just got fed up with that. I think that's very similar to what you've experienced in some places in the United States.
Oftentimes people look at that and think, how can the people, like the Indians or the Maori, shut themselves off like that, because what they're not going to have any prevention, or they're not going to have any health care, but what they're doing by shutting themselves off is they're saying, only until you work with us will we allow you to do this, but you have to treat us as equals. So this was something that happened recently in the United States. One of the reservations closed their doors to one of the government agencies in the United States to any of the research, and it's one of the big funding agencies for research in the United States. And when they closed their reservation off and said, we will not have any research on our reservation, we will not take any money from you, we will not allow you onto our reservation. And what they're telling them is that unless you bring us to the table as equals, unless you provide something to our people, we can't continue to work with you. And it's just a message that is really difficult to get across, that no matter what context it is in, it's only until you work together that you can actually accomplish something.
I would have thought with the huge diversity of races that are in schools now, I mean, in South Auckland, where I come from, there are just Maori, Pākehā, Polynesian, just Asians, a whole lot of different races all mixing in together now. And I would kind of thought that it would sort itself out, because in some of these schools now there almost is no predominant culture. Why isn't that happening?
Because we're not addressing it as a nation. We're not addressing it as families, as communities, as governments. Your government at least has the race relations. We have our our little institute over in not our institute, but we have our office over in the United States, but it's not effective because we don't address it as people.
So this idea that of the Office for the Race Relations Conciliator that we have here in New Zealand, that's something you'd quite like to see happen over in the States, is it?
Definitely. Partly because they're so proactive about going out and addressing it as with not just out in the community, but within themselves.
In the book Healing Racism in America, Nathan Rothstein, which is the basis of the Institutes for the Healing of Racism, Nathan Rothstein really, really strongly emphasises the importance of the oneness of humanity as being central to healing.
Part of that is because when you don't use the oneness of mankind as the basis for the institutes, they don't seem to work. There have been instances where people have not used it, and the institutes just do not work as well. So.
But when you put that concept back in, it all happens.
It all happens. It all comes together. It's almost like it's a cohesive. It's like the glue that holds it together.
Leslie, tell us, as an Indigenous person, why it is that so often the Indigenous people suffer so badly from alcoholism, from drug addiction, from very poor health, from unemployment, from high crime rates, all of these kinds of things. Why is that?
It's interesting you should ask that. One of the reasons they brought me to this conference was to address the issue of disadvantaged populations and Indigenous communities. And when you look at any of the disadvantaged or Indigenous populations, some of the things that stand out the most are the fact most of the time they're colonized populations. They are populations that have been discriminated against because of the race or because of some other factor. But primarily it's discrimination and the effects of that discrimination, not just because of their race, but because of where they stand in the class system. So you're seeing the effects of discrimination. You see health disparities because if you can't go out and get a job, you don't have access to health, you don't have access to anything. And for some of our populations, you don't see the ability. When you can't see the ability, when you cannot see that you can go out and get a job, you get hopeless. You start feeling like there's no way you're going to ever achieve something in this world.
Tell us about affirmative action and how well that works.
Affirmative action in our country was a system where they wanted to bring up the population to the point where they were equal. And I believe you told a story the other day about the disparities, and I think that was a perfect example of what is happening.
It was basically about imagining you have this boat sitting in the water, and the cargo has been loaded very, very badly into this boat, so it's all on one side. So you've got the boat sitting in the water, all sort of kilted over on one side. And if you can apply that to perhaps Māori and Pākehā in New Zealand, here we have the Māori people all on one side. They're burdened with debt, they're burdened with alcoholism and drug addiction and unemployment and poor health and all of these kinds of things. But somebody comes along and says, oh, we're going to treat everybody equal because that's the way it should be. So we'll give one for you and one for me and one for you and one for me. But guess what? The boat's still sitting in the water, all tilted over to one side. And to me, this is what affirmative action is all about. Affirmative action is about fixing up the balance of the boat first and then saying one for you and one for me and one for you and one for me.
Today what we need is race UNITY in a beautiful land, the sea, the sky.
It's the race for time, the place.
To see we're one family, it's the human race. Every woman, every man,
Black, brown, and tan.
it's the plan, my man, so take a stand for race. UNITY, understand my man for race unity. Race unity, my man, take a stand. Yeah.
How did you become a Baha'i, Leslie?
I've always been attracted to the practical side of the Baha'i faith, that you can be spiritual and you can also walk with your feet on the ground. This friend of mine invited me to have some coffee, and she also invited this wonderful, wonderful woman who sat and talked to me about who Abdu'l-Baha was, who Baha'u'llah was, and told me that Baha'u'llah was a messenger for this day and age, and that he had brought new principles and of the oneness of mankind, the equality of men and women, and then she told me about the laws, and when she told me about the laws, I thought, wow, this is really something to have a religion that had some very strict laws that could help me as an individual. When I was growing up on the reservation, it's very similar to what I understand is it's like in some of the Maori communities. There was a lot of alcohol and drugs and premarital sex, and so when she told me about that there was that you couldn't drink alcohol and that you couldn't have premarital sex and some of the other laws, the marriage laws, and to preserve the unity of the family, it just made so much sense to me, and it was like a protection for me to be able to say, I'm sorry, I don't drink, I'm a Baha'i. As long as I can keep that one thought in my head in any situation I'm in, I can say, I'm a Baha'i, I can't do that. Then it's a protection for me as an individual.
Leslie, thanks for being with us on the program today on healing racism. It's been really helpful to have your perspectives as an Indigenous person on how we should deal with this issue. So thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a wonderful 3 weeks, exhaustive but extremely wonderful. I love your country. I love your people. The people here in this country have been much more open, much more friendly than anyone I've met in the United States.
Thank you. Oh, that's nice to hear. You've been watching Baha'i On Air and our special program on healing racism. If you'd like to know more about the Baha'i faith, you can call us on 0800 Baha'i or 0800 224 247. Or you can check out our website www.baha'i.org.nz, or you can write to us at PO Box 21551 Henderson. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.